All right, so this week's video regards casual sex. Casual sex is certainly an interesting topic in its own right, and a topic that is important for you as a college age student to think about, to consider, because it's certainly part of your environment and something you got to deal with. So this week we have 4 readings, 2 of which you could classify as a kind of anti-casual sex, one of which is mixed in terms of its conclusion and results, and one of the articles is definitively pro-casual sex. So I'll start off with the anti-casual sex articles. The first one is a short CNN article, and it's called "No Hooking Up for Some College Co-eds." And essentially, the argument that this article makes on behalf of some students that are part of an anti-hooking up group is that the hooking up culture is emotionally destructive and it lowers self-esteem, and that it's essentially bad for you. It's bad for you emotionally, spiritually, to engage in the hookup culture. And so what is the evidence that they use to prove their points? The article references studies that show women more than men want sex to be connected with good relationships. And they also talk about studies that link the casual sex attitude towards to depression and to lower self-esteem. And I think there's this great quote from one of the groups that wants to bring back traditional dating, and it's kind of a funny quote, but it really, I think, says something worthwhile. And the idea here is, well, at least take me to dinner before you get down and dirty. And so the idea is that casual sex is essentially using people. You know, that you're using the girl just for sex if you're not even able to entertain a dinner conversation with her, do something nice for her before that expectation that sex occur. The article talks about this idea of being pressured, that there's a lot of pressure to engage in this culture. And one of the ways that this pressure manifests itself is thinking about sexual relationships in terms of 2 extremes. On one extreme, either you engage in casual sex, oftentimes connected with alcohol, and you just do it, or you don't engage in anything, you're no fun, you're a prude, and you're not part of the college culture at all. And because you have those 2 extremes, there's often not a room for a middle ground, and so that's what creates the pressure. Now, the Caitlin Flanagan article, "Are You There, God? It's Me, Monica," is a much longer article, but really, I think, provocative, really fascinating, and she as well is making the argument against casual sex based on the idea that casual sex is unfulfilling and ultimately damaging at an emotional and spiritual level. And she talks about, she begins her article with some stories, rather graphic stories about orgies and what she calls rainbow parties. And she says these are stories that are kind of put out there in the popular culture, as kind of legends of what is happening to today's youth, that they'll engage in sex anywhere, at any time, with anyone, and with any number. But she says, look, that's not really true. I mean, that is largely fabrications. Sure, there could be an orgy once in a while, but the reality is that the vast majority of sexual behavior from young people is not occurring in those type of situations. That's not the problem. Nor is she arguing that the problem is STDs or teen pregnancies. Certainly these would be problems, but for her, those are not the primary pervasive major kind of impacting problems associated with casual sex. And it's important to be clear about this as well. She's not saying wait until marriage. She's not saying that sex before marriage is wrong. But what she is saying is that sex before relationships, sex before there's a sense of commitment, sex before there's any sense of romance, sex before there's a sense of love, that's the problem. And she says this is what we've got to get away from. And as a culture, we have to critique this. We shouldn't glamorize it. In fact, we should glamorize and we should promote and we should support those people that are saying, look, I'll have sex with you, but, we've got to be in a relationship first. There's got to be love first. There's got to be romance first. There's got to be a connection. There's got to be a sense of trust. And so why does she argue this? Well, her argument is essentially that, for men, but more so for women, the feminine sexuality is connected with a sense of trust, compassion, really kind of a personal relationship with the one that you're going to have sex with. That's what women in particular want. And if they're not getting that, it's probably because they're letting themselves down. Essentially, they're saying, well, if I don't engage in sex, I'm not going to get in anything, or I'm going to be labeled a prude and he's going to leave me, so I've just got to do it because that's what is expected in today's culture. But when that happens, Flanagan argues, girls essentially let themselves down. They let themselves down because they don't demand that sex occur in the type of relationship that they want. And again, that type of relationship is one based on love, commitment, trust, romance, not necessarily marriage, but at least those things. And when you don't do it that way, girls are going to feel a little cheaper. Girls are going to feel less satisfied. Girls are going to feel a sense of regret. And again, this can be for guys too, but more so for women. And, that's the problem. That they're not demanding the best sexual experience for themselves. They're not demanding what they really want. But she's also really clear in this article that it's not the fault of young women. The fault is society as a whole. The fault is a society that essentially says waiting for sex is a waste of time. Waiting for sex is simply not the norm. Waiting for sex is old-fashioned. Waiting for sex is too judgmental. Waiting for sex is simply not the way that it occurs in this relationship. And she has this great line towards the end of the article where essentially she says, young girls are thrown out there in this culture, oftentimes a hip-hop culture, where women are objectified and treated as just pure pieces of meat. And there's no protection from them. There's no protection from that music. There's no protection from the movies, from the television, which essentially promotes this behavior. And she says that's where we, as the adult members of society, have let our children down. And so that's kind of her argument, that, look, it's not a fulfilling way to go. Okay, so those are the anti-casual sex articles. There is one that is mixed. It's ambivalent. And this is the article called Young Adults and Hookup Cultures. And it's interesting that they talk about there's been a radical change in the way that young people engage in sexual relationships. And that radical change has to do with moving towards a hookup culture from a dating culture. So the article mentions, or at least suggests, that in the past there was a dating culture. That before you hooked up with someone, before you had sex with someone, before you, kissed them or, went further, that there was the expectation that there would be a date. That you don't just kind of throw yourself into somebody's in bed. Now that has changed. Flanagan mentions it as well. She says, in my parents' time, sex was contained within marriage. That's when it was supposed to occur. In my time when I was growing up, sex occurred within the context of romance and love and commitment. In today's culture, sex occurs within no context. There's no expectation. And so we've moved culturally in terms of where we expect sex to occur. And in terms of this young adults in the hookup culture, they argue that there are people that still want the relationships. They want monogamy. They want to be in those kind of relationships, but they're waiting. They view that as kind of a time to occur in the future. But some, at least 50% of people that responded said they use casual sex as a way to get into a relationship. And ask yourself, well, is there any problem with that? Are there any emotional downsides to that? Is using sex in the hope that you might get a boyfriend or girlfriend, is that a problem at an emotional and spiritual level? So talking about this idea that casual sex leaves you unfulfilled and unsatisfied, again, here's where the article is pretty mixed. It said a substantial percentage of those that responded and that engaged in casual sex, 41%, said they regretted it. But you could object and you could say, well, does that mean that 59% didn't regret it? And so, we shouldn't associate casual sex with automatically being emotionally unfulfilling and unsatisfying. The other objection that they brought up is that, look, people from all times throughout human history have regretted their sexual choices. They've also regretted some of their romantic choices. But that's not necessarily a reason not to engage in sex or not to engage in romantic and pursue romantic relationships. Again, there's this idea that the long-term goal of almost everyone they studied is a monogamous, committed relationship. So that does show that that is a deep, deep desire. But the objection here is, well, that's true, but does that have to be the goal in people that are college age? Maybe it's just that goal has moved into a little bit of a later period of time. They also talk about this, the hookup culture. Again, it goes back to the pressure that I spoke about in that first article, where your personal worth can be connected with hooking up. And that pressure sometimes means that hookup is the term used to cover a whole bunch of things, from kissing a girl or a guy to taking off the other person's shirt to full-fledged sex. When I was in college, hooking up meant that you kissed a girl. Not that you're having sex. That was a different kind of category. And so maybe these authors argue that we use the term hookup so broadly because people are pressured and they want to feel part of it, even if they haven't gone completely in, even if they don't want to go completely in. So I think it'd be interesting to ask you, do you feel that pressure? Okay, so there's been the anti-casual sex, the mixed kind of article about casual sex, and then the article that certainly promotes casual sex, and that is aptly titled 8 One-Night Stands, 8 Reasons to Have Them. So this author is going to argue that there's nothing wrong with one-night stands, in fact, that they can be a positive, they can be a good thing. And essentially, she's going to list her 8 reasons, but in the first paragraph, she offers a rejection and an objection to the Flanagan-like position that casual sex is unfulfilling and emotionally kind of barren and devastating and harmful. She says, I remember one of my one-night stands, and it was wonderful. It was great. It was some of the best sex of my life. And she says she thinks about that fondly. So the point there is that it's not necessary, casual sex is not necessarily connected with a lack of emotional fulfillment. And the other reason that big reason that she advocates for the legitimacy of a one-night stand is that it allows you to experiment. It allows you to find out more about yourself. Okay, and so what are the 8 reasons? You can kind of read through them yourself, but essentially she argues that doing something that makes you feel good at a purely physical level of pleasure is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Something done for pure physical pleasure is all right. Think about that in relationship to Mill. John Stuart Mill, who argues that what we really want are these emotional, spiritual satisfactions. She also argues that guilt is not so much a product of feeling like you've let yourself down, but a product of feeling like you haven't behaved in the way that society wants you to behave. And so here the argument is, it's not so much that casual sex is wrong or that women don't like it as much as men. The argument that she makes is that women's hesitancy about casual sex and the kind of need or the view that sex within relationships is better is based on a cultural kind of construction, that you're taught as a woman that you shouldn't sleep around, that you shouldn't have casual sex, that casual sex is bad, and men are taught that it's okay. And so it's not that women fundamentally want something different out of sex than men, it's just that that's what they've been brought up to believe. So that is, again, something really interesting to compare with Flanagan, who disagrees with that position. She talks about one-nighters being different than casual sex. She talks about, hey, it's okay, self-esteem boost, and a little bit of pleasure is a good thing when you're waiting for that Mr. Right. You don't have to kind of hold off on all pleasure until Mr. or Mrs. Right comes into your life. She talks about casual sex being great release when you're feeling anger, when you're feeling revenge, and she also talks about it being exciting and experimental. And then finally, the more you know about yourself sexually, the more you'll engage in good sex. So she argues actually that casual sex can be connected with a more fulfilling form of sexuality, and that this is true for both men and women. All right, so that's a brief recap of some of the main points of the 4 different articles, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.